Hello, my name is Julie, and it's time to talk about the 13 books that I read in December. 2024 is officially over. It is 2025, and it's time to talk about the last batch of books that I read in 2024. For the entirety of the month, I was participating in my readathon freezathon. It's team-based competitive, and it's all about reading wintry themed books. So a lot of the books that I read here have at least some vague tie to winter. I think what I found in this month is that I had a distinctly average in terms of my 2024 reading. I read the average number of books, a little bit over the average number of pages. My star rating was almost exactly average. So this is almost pretty indicative of my reading this year. Let's talk about my stats for this last month. I read 13 books for a total of 5,023 pages, which is the third most amount of pages I read in a month this year. My average rating was 3.67, which is very close to my annual average, and I did not have any books that I gave a solid 5 stars this month. The average page count of a book was 386 pages, and I read about 162 pages a day. I read 9 books from my TBR, that's my physical and audiobook TBR, but because of the holidays and me unhauling books and getting books because of that, and then also end of year sales, I actually added 24 books to my TBR, physically and on audio. I did unhaul 2 books from my TBR. A couple months back, I did an unhaul video. Those books I actually got rid of this month, so that's where they came out in my spreadsheet. If my calculations are correct, I think I have about a -6 of my TBR for the entire year. I think that's the first time this has ever happened, so very happy about that. Let's do my pie charts. My genres were all over the board this month, but we can see I tried to do 1/3 mystery, thriller, horror, 1/3 general fiction / romance, and 1/3 fantasy sci-fi because of my readathon freezathon. Each of the teams I tried to read evenly for, and then I had a nonfiction that I didn't finish in Nonfiction November. For series standing, I read over half standalones, but I did read 2 first books in series, 2 sequels, and 1 conclusion. As always, I read about 1/3 audiobooks and only 1 young adult in a sea of adult books. Let's get into those reviews. So the first book that I read in December was The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. The Radium Girls is a historical nonfiction that is talking about the group of women who in the World War I era were all employees of different radium watch companies. Radium was lauded as this miracle element, and it was being put in everything. And one of the things that the US really wanted to push was glow-in-the-dark things. So they made glow-in-the-dark watches for the army. And one of the jobs at this factory would be for women to paint the numbers on the watch dial. And they were instructed by the people who were in charge to lick the paintbrush every time they ran out of paint to get the tip to have a finer point. This led to these women ingesting radium paint all day, every day, some of them for years. But what happened is these women did not start seeing the side effects of radium for years, and the laws at the time protected the company from people having lawsuits against them. So what we see over the course of years is the women who joined the company, what their everyday was like, what happened to their bodies as they were torn apart, and the amount of gaslighting the companies did to try to make it so they wouldn't lose their precious money. I mean, this book is harrowing. There is pretty detailed descriptions of the way these women's bodies wasted away. It felt like reading a horror book, and it was possibly even worse the amount of jumping through hoops that these companies did because they did not want to have bad PR. And even though the people who were in charge knew that radium was bad for them, that information was not provided to these women because people cared more about making a good product than they cared about the safety of these people. There were so many other people who worked closely with radium who were in like full hazmat suits all the time. They thought because there was such a little amount of radium in the paint that it wouldn't matter. If you touched radium, You're not going to be hit by alpha waves because your skin is going to protect you. These women were ingesting it straight into their bloodstreams. I think that this was a very comprehensive look into the case and the history of these women and trying to piece together their lives from what we know about them. And I think that this did such a good job showing how far these women had to go to fight for their own lives. I'm still not really comfortable rating nonfiction, but I definitely do recommend this to you if you think you can handle hearing about their bodies. Book 2, I read A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams. I have read 7 Days in June by her, and I really enjoyed that one, and this is her 2024 release. This is about Ricky Wilde, who comes from a rich family, and she has always been seen as the black sheep because she does not operate the same way as everybody else. She's not in the family business, and she wants to do her own thing. She decides that she is going to open a flower shop in New York, which this is like, I swear to God, like the 5th romance book that I've read where somebody is opening a flower shop in New York. But she ends up accidentally running into this man a couple of times who she is absolutely taken by, but there's something strange about him. And that's that he is not from this time. He was actually born in the early 1900s and did experience the Harlem Renaissance, and he is a musician, and this is their love story. I enjoyed the first maybe third of this book when our characters like kind of haven't met yet and we're doing their own personal journeys. It felt like as soon as these characters decided they wanted to be with each other, nothing else was going on with them. Like they did not exist as characters with personality anymore. It felt very insta-lovey the way that they interacted with each other. I don't know, I think this is trying to be more on the literary side of romance, at least how it was set up at the beginning, and then at the end it didn't feel like it was keeping the same tone. I don't know, I just didn't really care about these two being together. And honestly, I'm even struggling to remember what I really thought about this book because I just don't think it will stay in my mind. I don't think that the characters really stuck out to me. I don't think the plot really stuck out to me. There was also one scene where a character basically fucks a piano, which was really weird. It wasn't 7 Days in June. I think I'm giving it a 3, maybe a 3.5. I like the beginning, but I just didn't really care by the end. Then I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This is a fantasy that is set at the turn of the century. Our main character, Emily Wilde, is a scientist. She is a professor of dryadology, and she is trying to put together the world's first comprehensive encyclopedia of all of the world's fairies. And she is going to be going to this Nordic-inspired country where they have a type of fairy that has never really been proven to be true outside of folklore. Here's the thing, she's not very good with people. She's really having a problem with the people who are from this area. Then her academic rival, who's only a couple years older than her, but has everything that he's ever wanted in academic circles because he's so charming, barges in and is like, hey, I'm gonna help you even though you didn't ask for it. I thought this was fun and it was fine. I actually did read this book in my vlog where I read 3 different Orangery books for Freezathon, so if you want to see my thoughts while reading this, you can go check that video out here. But I thought the 2 best parts of this book were Emily herself. I think she's a fun character to follow. She's very invested in science, and sometimes she does the right thing, but not for the right reason. She does it because she's trying to pursue science, which I think is interesting. I also really liked that the type of fairies we have here are the original idea of fairies being creepy little tricksters. That is so much more interesting to me than any version of a fae. I did not really care about the love interest in this book. He was kind of strange. There were a couple moments that he kind of felt out of place in the book. There were a couple times where we actually see from his perspective because we're seeing Emily's journals, which I think was a fun way to tell the story, and he fills in a couple of times where she's out of the picture. And I actually would have liked to see more from him. I think the fact that it was only utilized 2 times in the whole book was a little bit weird, especially because there's a whole section where Emily is really missing out on information. There were some times where I really felt like tension of like, oh, this is really dangerous, and I thought the book went into a cool direction of how dangerous and ugly things got and seemed. And then the final act of the book came, and it felt like everything was solved super easily. Our main character, who is supposed to be so knowledgeable, is kind of no longer utilized, and I didn't really like that. She is in this impossible situation to get out of, and her friends just get her out of there. Like, no problem. Like, why would you even try? It was so easy. Didn't love that, but I don't know. I think I'm gonna give this like a 3.5. Fun, but I don't know how long I'm gonna be thinking about this. I wouldn't be opposed to continue on the series, but probably wouldn't be anytime soon. Then I read Us Against You by Fredrik Backman. This is the second book in the Beartown series, which is a contemporary story about a small town in northern Sweden where the entire town's economy, culture, lifestyle is entirely pinned on their hockey club, and specifically their junior level hockey club. There's very little economic opportunity in the area, and if the hockey club isn't bringing in money, there's nothing to keep the town going. And in the first book, we know that something terrible is going to happen and it is going to relate to the hockey team. We don't know what it is until a lot of the way through the book. And this is repercussions of the first book. It's hard to talk about this book without spoilers because we follow so many different characters in this. I really like these books as ensemble pieces. I think Fredrik Backman is a great person to be doing ensemble pieces. In just a single scene, you can see a person's entirety. You will feel such a deep emotion for them. I did not love the particular plot of this book as much as I loved book one. In this book, we have a politician who is kind of trying to turn the entire town against each other, which I thought was interesting and is actually very relevant to today's current climate. But I wasn't as invested in that plot going on and the things surrounding it. I liked a couple of the characters that we followed. I could have even used more time with some of the characters that we followed in book one. I did think by the end that it did get a little bit kitchen sinky, but it kind of can get away with it more than other books because it is following so many different people and every single character's got to have something going on. I enjoyed this. I think I'm giving this above probably a 4.25. I think this was a very solid sequel. You can treat Beartown as a standalone. It totally stands up on its own, but I think that this was a worthy follow-up. Then I listened to Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is a horror that was translated from Spanish and is set in Argentina anywhere from the 1960s to the 1990s. And we are following a family who is involved in magic and the occult. The main people that we are following are a father who has been abused a lot of his life by the magic society that he was in, and his son who is trying to live under his father who's doing his best but still sort of passes on some of that trauma to him, especially because the father is the chosen one of this group of people and they want that to pass on to his son, and he doesn't want his son involved in it at all. And each of the different acts of this book we are seeing at a different time, and most of them from a different perspective. I don't think I was really invested in this book until like halfway through. The first section of this book, where we're in the middle of the timeline in the story, the son is a child, I didn't feel very grounded in the story. Like, I felt like I was getting the surface level of what was happening, but I didn't really absorb the stuff that was happening underneath. But as we got further and the son, Gaspar, got older, and he was the main force of this, I got more involved. Especially there's a specific perspective where we follow someone who's not related to the family at all. I thought that that was such a fantastic piece of like short fiction just in the middle of this book. Really, really enjoyed that act. That was probably my favorite part. This book is a slower historical literary horror where the main draw here is about generational trauma and trying to break cycles, especially the last act of Gaspar really taking the lead and everything and trying to take down this evil family that he's been born into. I really got into rooting for him. So I get why so many people like this one. I just like wasn't feeling it until the halfway point, and I feel like that's a me thing. Maybe if I had read this physically, I wouldn't have had that experience. I'm giving this a 3.5. I think. I know that I'm wrong, and that's a very unpopular opinion to have about this book, but it took me a minute. Then I read In the Weeds by B.K. Borison. This is the second book in the Lovelight Farm series, which is a series of standalone romances that all take place around this Christmas tree farm. The first book, Lovelight Farms, was my favorite romance that I read in 2024, so I have been eagerly awaiting this one. This is about our main characters, Evelyn and Beckett. Beckett is the main farmer on the Christmas tree farm, and Evelyn is a social media person who does a lot of travel stuff. Her main thing is highlighting small businesses across the country. And they ended up meeting at a conference, and uncharacteristic of either of them, having a one-night stand. And then they end up meeting again accidentally in the first book when she is running a social media competition that the Christmas tree farm is part of. At the beginning of this book, Evelyn is feeling very lost and disconnected from her job and wants to go back to the last time she felt happy, which was on the farm. So she goes back to this small town. Look, I don't think I would have picked up this premise if it was not in this series. But I was like, I really trust her after I thought she did a lot of good stuff in book one of making what felt like a pretty emotionally mature, to me, romance of people finally breaking out of their barrier of not being able to communicate. And these people never figure out how to communicate at all. This was so freaking frustrating to read the whole time. I feel like these characters do not ever get to know each other. At the beginning, they're like, oh, do I know that I have a connection with this person because we just had a one-night stand or whatever? And then they start sharing a house, and the book talks a lot about how they have been interacting with each other, but we really don't actually see them do real one-on-one talking about actual things going on in their lives. 75% of this book is one of the two of them thinking, oh, I'm just really into this person, and they're like not even in the same place. So much time spent apart even though they're in the same house. And I don't think these characters know each other at all. It's a lot of telling instead of showing, and I just did not like it. I also don't think Beckett's that great. I don't love that one of the only things he really gets to do in this book is that when his sister gets dumped in like not a great way, he decides to, instead of talk to his sister and try to make her feel better, because obviously this guy just wasn't emotionally immature enough to have a relationship, he decides to go to that man's place of work and threaten him with violence. That's not what I'm looking for when I'm reading a book with this cover. Also, the social media aspect of this did not really feel realistic, true to form to me, personally. I just was not rooting for them to be together because I don't think we as the reader even get to know these characters very well compared to the other book. I don't think these characters know each other very well. I'm like, give me a single reason to root for them that's not that they like to sleep together. You can't. Oh, should I give this less than a 3-star? Should this be more like a 2.5? Or even a 2? I don't know, haven't thought about it, oopsies. Then I read Boys in the Valley by Peter Fracassi. This is a horror that is set at the turn of the century. It is set at a boys' orphanage that is run by the Catholic Church. When a man who is injured is brought in, and some strange things start happening because something is not right with the injured man. I went into this book knowing absolutely nothing. This was the buddy read for the horror team, and I needed a wintry book to read. It has been pitched as The Exorcist meets Lord of the Flies. I'm not really one for like possession-y horror. This style is not something that I normally would pick up, but it was cool to try it. This to me is a popcorn horror. It is a pure entertainment horror. I really didn't get much deeper than that out of it. I think it had a pretty good plot. The pacing was really good. You really did just keep flipping the pages. The chapters were short. The thing that I will say is weird is that we have different points of view, and what happens is that we'll follow this point of view and there will be a revelation, and then we'll follow this point of view, but it's gonna start earlier, and then they're gonna have this, see the thing, and then have their reaction. So even though this book is like 350 pages or something like that, it feels like there's less than 300 pages of actual plot and stuff happening because we're revisiting things so often. I'm not sure how I feel about that choice. This book just kind of does what it says on the tin. So I think I'm gonna give it a 3.5. Like, there's nothing that I would really knock this book for. It just wasn't necessarily my brand. Then for my book club, 3 of Clubs, we have been reading Gothic books for the last quarter of 2024, and the book that was voted on to read in December was Evocation by S.T. Gibson. This is the first book in a new series called The Summoner Circle, and it is an urban fantasy where there is a society of people who can do different types of sorcery and witchcraft. Our main character is David, and he comes from a long line of people who have been successful in sorcery, and he is finding out that the supposed demonic curse that's run through his family is actually real, and it is going to be affecting him before his next birthday, and he is trying to figure out how to get rid of it. And the only way he knows how to do that is his ex-boyfriend, who this ex-boyfriend is actually married. So this is something that's really complicating his life. I have read S.T. Gibson's 2 other full-length novels. I loved them both, and I heard that this one was pretty different. I don't know that it is that different. Those 2 are very similar. They take place in the same universe. They're about vampires. They have extremely similar tones. I think they might be kind of similar, but I just don't think the execution in this book is as good as I thought her other 2 books were. It sets up like this urban fantasy world where we see just very vague shapes. We don't really get a lot of details about what this world even includes. The focus of this book is almost entirely on the relationship between these 3 people. This book does not build out the fantasy part of this world at all. It is just these 3 people trying to figure out their feelings about each other. And if you go in knowing that, I think you're gonna like it a little bit more. But it felt to me like the world that we were inhabiting was being underdeveloped rather than it not being important that it was developed. This book could have been 200 pages longer and included stuff about the world and learning more about what things were going on, especially because the magic actually does tie in to the themes of the story. It just feels like a little bit of Deus Ex Machina that we don't really know anything about the magic. Solutions to problems aren't presented until they're already being used, and like, that's not really great fantasy plotting. I think that S.T. Gibson is so good at writing chemistry between characters. Like, all of these characters bounce off of each other really well. The problem I had here is I also don't think that these characters, they did not feel like individuals. They felt like they were just set up to have conversations with each other. This book honestly felt like fan fiction of something to me. I was never really much of a fan fiction person, but like, it feels like this is a fan fiction of something else that doesn't exist. It's like when you're reading a fan fiction and they don't need to tell you anything about these characters because you as the reader are already supposed to know that. I got through this and I was definitely rooting for these characters, but I just don't think that enough was fleshed out for this to be fully successful, especially because this series is supposed to follow each of our characters individually, so this is David's book. I don't feel like we get to know David very well for this to be David's book. I think I'm giving this maybe a 3.25. I think that sounds right. Bit of a shame. I kind of saw it coming, even though that was one of my most anticipated books of the year. Then I read Katie by Michael McDowell. This is the final book of my 12 books, 12 friends, 12 months challenge for 2024. It's set in the mid to late 1800s. Our main character is very poor, her and her mother living penny to penny. It turns out that our main character's grandfather is trying to get her mother back into his life and try to give his inheritance to her. And our main character goes to go collect that inheritance. But who ends up being there but her grandfather's former son-in-law, his daughter, and his new wife. They are all very evil people. They simply want to get the money and run. They are extremely cruel to animals and people and everything around them, and something's weird with the daughter, Katie. Bodies start dropping, and we follow our main character as Katie and her family keep trying to take everything from her at every single point. Our main character's name is Philo. So this book was written in the 80s. It feels older. It feels more almost of the time period in the path that Philo takes. Every time something good happens to her, something terrible happens to her. Something even better happens to her, something even worse happens to her. So it becomes a little bit predictable in that way, even in like the horror slasher part of this book being pretty stark in comparison to the rest of the story. I found this to be enjoyable. I was 100% rooting for Philo. I think Katie is a fun villain to follow. I think that it really is the driving force of this is our main character Philo, who is such a good person who has been shoved with so many terrible opportunities around her, and she keeps trying to dig out of that by being a good person, and she keeps being rewarded, but because these people who are evil know that she's around, they want to take things from her. And I just had a solid time about this. So it was cool to give a book that I had never heard of, that's like 40 years old, a shot. So I'm giving this a very, very solid 4-star. Then I decided to read The Blue Book of Nebo by Manon Stephan Ross. This is a speculative novella that is about a mother and son pair who have experienced what seems like the end of the world. They're living in Wales. The boy is in early teenagehood and has been in this apocalypse for several years now and has mostly grown up to it and adapted to it. He has a little sister who's only 2 years old, and he is just trying to make a life for his family. His mother is very haunted by their past life. And as the son is becoming older and more mature and finally putting things together for the first time, he is sort of having more questions for his mother. And this is told in a journal that they are sharing and not reading each other's parts. We see through both of their eyes what little they know about what actually happened about the apocalypse, a little bit about their life beforehand, how harrowing life has been over the last several years. I think that this was beautifully written. This audiobook is actually performed by the author, which I thought was really cool. I think this book could have been longer. The start and end points were correct, but I think we could have gotten even more from this. I would love to have spent even more time with these characters. It's very short, and I think it really packs a punch as our main characters are kind of questioning, as one does in an apocalyptic story, like what it really means to be alive, and sometimes struggling to make it through and deal with the loss of what was. This was really emotionally potent. It's only that short and you do feel really, really strong emotions from it. So I did not cry, but I was very upset by it. And I do think that this is definitely one that could make you cry, even in its very short page count. So I'm giving it more than a 4.25, 4.75. I don't know. It doesn't feel like a full 5, but it definitely is one of the most recommendable books that I read this year. Then I read Kingdom of Sweets by Erica Johansson. This is the author who wrote The Queen of the Tearling, which is one of my favorite series ever. And this is a retelling, reimagining of the Nutcracker, where we have Clara actually having a sister, Natasha, and when they were young, their godfather, I wanted to say Dostoevsky, it's Drosselmeyer. Their godfather, Drosselmeyer, came in when they were christened, said that Clara was light and Natasha was darkness. And Clara has been the golden child her entire life. Natasha has constantly been neglected by her parents because they kind of don't want anything to do with her and her darkness, even though nobody really knows what that even means. We follow Natasha on her 16th birthday when Drosselmeyer comes back and brings out his toys, and the two of them end up getting sucked into the land of the Sugar Plum Fairy. This is one of the lowest rated books that I've read this year, that I own, whatever. I'm kind of curious why. I don't think it's bad. It is a weird book. I think maybe if people were like, oh, fantasy based on the Nutcracker, like maybe they're not anticipating this to go in the dark area it's kind of going. It definitely got shocking in some points. I think the lengths that this went to definitely surprised me, especially for a book that was picked by Book of the Month. I think Natasha is an interesting character to follow, as she has been so shaped by the fact that nobody likes her because of what has been put upon her. It feels very much like Wicked. Somebody has been branded as good and somebody has been branded as evil. That has shaped their behaviors, but it was kind of weird. This book decides to like skip forward in time a lot. And like the farther we went in this book, the more I was lost in the plot. Like, I understand that the Nutcracker is supposed to be like a dream, but it felt like a dream in that like I kind of wasn't grounded in what could happen, what was going on, what is the reality here. But I don't know where it was going. I don't know, like I wasn't left with a strong impression. Sometimes I was just kind of like, what's going on? I think it's a 3-star. It didn't click with me, and I think that that's probably what the general consensus is. Then I read Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is my bind up of his first 3 books. I'm not gonna hold this the whole time, but yes, I read Salem's Lot. I have read The Shining, so all I have left is Carrie, and then this can get off of my TBR shelf. Salem's Lot is a story about Ben Mears, who is a middlingly successful novelist who has returned to a town that he lived in when he was a boy for about a year. And there is a creepy house there that a murder-suicide took in that has haunted him for his whole life. And so he decides to go back to that town as an adult to try to work on his novel to sort of process that. Things start happening in this town around the time that he gets there. People start going missing, people start dying for kind of no reason, and there are new people who have decided to buy outright this old house that the murder-suicide took place in, and shady things seem to be happening. This is around maybe my 10th Stephen King. I'm not sure on my count. I think this places in the middle for me. This feels like it should be early Stephen King because this feels like it is setting the groundwork for what he's going to do in The Stand, where we have this ensemble cast of characters who are slowly figuring things out together, but they all also have their own individual things going on, and just the setup of that felt so much like The Stand, but The Stand is like masterpiece, and this was like, okay, cool. Stephen King really does shine in an ensemble piece. They'll have such a strong voice for one person, and then you go to a different person and they'll have such a strong voice. I wasn't crazy invested in a lot of our characters, but I did want the bad guy to go down. I think it's just weird. I read 2 books this month that are both like, you fight off the bad guy with like a crucifix and praying at them and like going for Catholic Church things. That's not something I normally pick up to begin with, like that monster horror where you can just pray at them and they go away. He definitely has written some misogynistic characters who are purposefully misogynistic, but like even in our characters who we're supposed to root for, the phrase sexy little girl lisp was used to describe a teenager. Nasty phrase to be using, Stephen, and it's in a character who we are supposed to super root for. I think I'll probably give this like a 4. I was engaged the whole time and I was flipping through the pages really fast. And you know what? If you're looking for a good monster horror, I don't think you can go wrong with this one. And the last book that I read this month was Heavenly Tyrant by Xiran Zhao. And with that, I have completed my 20 books to read in 2024 and also the Buzzword Readathon Challenge. This came out on Christmas Eve and I have been listening to it since. So this is the sequel to Iron Widow. It's taking place in a mostly sci-fi world, but there is a little bit of magic in it. Our main character Zetian is inspired by China's only female emperor, Pacific Rim E. So there are these alien-y creatures and humans have been able to take parts of their corpses and make giant mechs to fight them, to try to continue to survive. To pilot them, a boy and a girl will be in the seat, and almost every single time the girl dies. And at the beginning of the first book, Zetian's sister is killed in this way, and so she decides that she is going to volunteer to try to kill this boy who killed her sister. Really goes on from there, but that's the synopsis. And this book goes even further from book 1. There were some really interesting developments at the end of book 1 that I was like, where on earth is this going? And I thought that this book did such a fantastic job moving on from what the first book felt like. It let itself do other things. It let itself question things about previous characters or move on from other characters and introduce new people that felt natural in this world. It did not feel like when you're in the second season of a TV show and they just add a new character because they needed somebody new. It felt very natural to have this new character be so important to the plot. I really enjoyed this book because it is very political. Our main character has gone from being at the bottom rungs of society to being in a position of power, but she is still a woman in a very patriarchal society. There's a lot of like eat the Richie type narrative as there are revolutions going on, trying to and sometimes succeeding in overthrowing old things to try to make the world better. But maybe these people who are trying to make the world better aren't actually that great of people and aren't standing for everything that they should. They're just putting forth certain agendas and not seeing their own blind spots and how hypocritical they are. Wow, this book could not be more relevant to December 2024. There's not nearly as much action all the time throughout this book, but I thought that this book was still very engaging, and I really enjoyed seeing her change over the course of this book. There were some revelations that happened in this that was like, oh my god. And the final act of this just really was like, let's go, action, consequences. I did speed up the pace of me listening to this audiobook halfway through it, so the second half is going to feel shorter to me than it actually was, but I did feel like the final act of this felt very short. I felt like we could have spent more time seeing a peek behind the curtain of what's going on. There is also relationships happening in this book that I was really afraid were going to go in one direction and absolutely went in the direction that I wanted them to. So that's great. There was a lot that I really liked about this book, but I was not quite as obsessed with this book as I was the first book. So I think this is like a 4.5, 4.75 to me. I think that this is really interesting that this is shelved in YA because I think a lot of the themes and the discussions feel adult, but maybe it is that it's not talking down to young people and it's actually talking about what it takes to make real societal change. Very, very solid follow-up to Iron Widow, and I cannot wait to see what Sharon has next. So those are all the books that I read in December. Please let me know what you ended up finishing the year out with, and hold on tight for the different end of year, beginning of the year videos that I have coming out. I'm definitely going to be doing my best books of the year and my final stats for all of 2024, looking at my spreadsheet that is extremely in depth, as well as a spreadsheet you haven't seen before that is my series statistics. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to find me anywhere else on the internet, you can find me at that link in the description. And if you would like to see more of my videos, you can hit that subscribe button and hit the bell if you want to be notified when I do post a video. And as always, I will see you in the next one.